It is often said that a single choice can alter the course of your life, though not necessarily in a grand, life-altering manner. At times, it unfolds quietly, almost imperceptibly, a gradual revelation that escapes your notice until the moment has passed. That night changed everything for me. I never thought I would feel that way. I once believed I had a clear understanding of myself, aware of my boundaries and the lines I would steadfastly refuse to cross. Yet, existence has a peculiar manner of challenging you, nudging you into situations you never imagined you would encounter. What's truly terrifying? Times it arrives unexpectedly. It was never meant to be anything significant. Merely a dialogue. Hold on for a second. Simply a request. I was taken aback when my step-younger brother posed that question to me. I was surprised to find myself agreeing. I certainly didn't foresee what transpired next. However, to be truthful, the most frightening aspect wasn't the events that unfolded. It was exactly how I desired it to be. And that's what I can express openly. Many have stood at the precipice of choices they once vowed to avoid, and you're certainly not the only one. Join us today, for the reality is that life is much more intricate than we often care to acknowledge. It's essential to begin at the start. Such a tale doesn't unfold in the blink of an eye. It's not a spontaneous decision, nor a careless error born from a brief lapse in judgment. No, these elements they construct. They flourish in the quiet moments, in the words left unsaid, in the subtle, nearly imperceptible changes that eventually demand attention. What is my name? That isn't particularly significant. What holds significance is that I was, and still am, a wife. A nurturing figure. To an observer, it appeared as though they possessed it all. A charming residence nestled in a serene community. A partner who contributed, who took charge, who fulfilled all his obligations. And yet, if you were to enter my world, beyond the meticulously arranged images on the walls, beyond the joyous laughter at gatherings, beyond the flawlessly rehearsed dialogues between my partner and me, you would sense it. The emptiness within. The void that expanded between us, widening until we became mere strangers cohabiting the same space. We didn't always find ourselves in this situation. There was a time many years back, when I believe we shared a deep affection for one another. We made an effort, or so it seems. Yet, time has a tendency to take away what matters. Closeness, dedication, bonds. At some point we lost sight of one another. Ceased contact. Ceased discussions on topics of real significance. At this point he seems perpetually occupied. Time to take some calls for work. Meetings that run late. Business trips that appear to stretch on endlessly with each occurrence. When he is home, he is present, yet somehow absent. In his study, surrounded by a sea of emails. He hardly raises his gaze as I pass by. What about me? I ceased my efforts. Ceased my attempts to gain his attention. Ceased the struggle for something that had no desire to be preserved. That type of solitude is often incomprehensible to others. With a husband by my side, a home to call my own, and a life to navigate, I found solace in companionship. Yet I might as well have been unseen. And then there was him. My younger stepbrother. He was never meant to stay here, not for the long haul at least. Only a brief interlude, a couple of months as he worked to piece his life back together. My husband's mother's son from a previous marriage. He's technically family, but not in any meaningful sense. He was a bit younger than I was, but not by a significant margin. In his late teens or early 20s, yet possessing a demeanor that suggested a maturity beyond his years. A presence that effortlessly filled the space around it. Charming. Whimsical. A person who could turn any situation into a punchline, exuding a natural self-assurance, as if life had always treated him kindly. Perhaps it hadn't. Or perhaps he had simply discovered the art of finding humor in the midst of it all. Yet there was an additional element. There lies a depth beneath the playful jabs and the sly grins. A burden he bore. A sorrow that quietly seeped through the gaps when he believed he was unseen. I recognized it, as that sensation was familiar to me. He arrived at a time when my marriage was at its lowest point, when my husband had entirely disengaged, and I had ceased to feign any interest. Initially, he was merely a figure in the house, another individual moving through spaces I hardly inhabited any longer. Yet a change occurred. Perhaps it was the manner in which he engaged with me, truly engaged with me. Not from a sense of duty, not in a daze, but wholeheartedly. As if I had something valuable to say. Perhaps it was the manner in which he perceived me, truly perceived me. Not in the role of a wife nor as a mother to someone, but simply as an individual. An individual. Or perhaps it was simply that, after what felt like an eternity, I finally sensed a spark of vitality once more. Initially there was simply emptiness. Simply dialogues shared over coffee during the mornings. Light-hearted banter exchanged in the kitchen. Trivial, insignificant matters. Yet solitude can be a perilous companion. When hunger strikes, even the tiniest morsels can feel like a grand banquet. Our home was stunning, reminiscent of the kind of places featured in lifestyle publications. Contemporary, sophisticated, every detail impeccably arranged. Yet, no one reveals that a home can embody both fullness and emptiness simultaneously. The kitchen, perpetually immaculate, perpetually poised for a meal that never truly seemed communal. The living room, featuring a couch that held more echoes of silence than bursts of laughter. The bedroom, chilled on one side, scarcely disturbed, a realm that once held the essence of something akin to love. And now this house possessed him. He transformed the atmosphere within these confines. In a space that was previously filled with quiet, joy now echoed through the air. Eeriness, a fresh vitality that was previously unknown. I reassured myself that it posed no danger. It was simply pleasant to have someone to converse with. I was simply glad to feel acknowledged. However, the reality was that I had begun to traverse boundaries in my thoughts long before I ever did so in the real world. And what about that? That marked the initial error. It was an evening just like all the rest. Or at least that's what I convinced myself of. My husband was home, yet he remained as he always did. Here but not truly here. Confined within his study, the flickering glow of the computer screen seeped through the narrow gap beneath the door. When I last heard his voice, it was sharp and unfocused. Yet another project stretching into the late hours. Yet another justification. I ceased inquiring about when he would finish. No longer staying up for him. Instead, I found myself in the living room, nestled on the couch with a blanket wrapped around my legs, half-heartedly watching a nondescript show flickering on the screen. A subtle presence that fills the silence, creating a sense of companionship in solitude. And then he entered the room. My younger stepbrother. He had no business being here tonight. He often ventured out, leading his own life, surrounded by his own circle. Yet this evening, for reasons unknown, he chose to remain. He stood in the doorway initially, observing me with that relaxed, crooked grin of his. "You look miserable," he said teasingly, yet there was a gentle undertone that revealed he wasn't merely joking. I let out a chuckle, shaking my head in disbelief. "I appreciate that," he insisted. "No, really." Venturing deeper within. "What makes you choose to sit here by yourself?" His casual, direct approach made a tightness form in my chest. I might have been able to dismiss it. I might have cracked a joke, mentioned how much I enjoy my solitude. Yet, the truth escaped my lips before I had a chance to intervene. "Since there's no one else to share this moment with." The words lingered in the air, more burdensome than I intended. He paused, silence hanging in the air. Simply gazed in my direction. With a subtle shake of his head, he let out a sigh. "That's unfortunate." I released a breathy chuckle, my eyes rolling in exasperation. "Indeed, welcome to the journey of marriage. Must it really be that way?" The inquiry was subtle and contemplative, surprising me unexpectedly. I stared at him, my grip on the blanket in my lap growing firmer. I was at a loss for words in response to that. What is the reality? My certainty had begun to wane. I once thought that love was a thing that would only diminish if you allowed it to. That fervor, bond, those elements could be cultivated, safeguarded. What about now? At that moment, uncertainty crept in. Perhaps, I finally replied. Perhaps certain matters simply reach their natural conclusion. I thought he would just move on from it. Let's shift our focus. Instead, he strolled over, plopped down on the couch next to me, and snatched the remote from my grasp. All right, he remarked, browsing through the channels. Let's embrace joy tonight instead. I arched an eyebrow. What do you envision? He shot me a sly glance, a smirk playing on his lips. There's something far more engaging than this drivel you're currently viewing. I couldn't help but chuckle, shaking my head in disbelief. In an instant, the tension dissipated. It was meant to be that way, or so it seemed. We found ourselves engaged in conversation. Initially, it revolves around trivial matters, light and inconsequential. The type of late-night dialogues that create a sense of closeness, making the world seem more connected and personal. He shared the story of his life, his struggles, and the aspirations that seemed just out of grasp. I shared my story with him, at least the parts one felt comfortable revealing. Eventually, he rose and took a bottle of wine from the kitchen. "Come on," he said, pouring us each a glass. "Let's embrace a little chaos. Keep the night alive. Experience youth once more." I sighed dramatically but accepted the glass regardless. We indulged in some drinks. We shared a hearty laugh. The barriers that separated us, those silent limits that once existed, began to dissolve. Then he inquired, "Shall we take a drive?" I blinked. At this moment, what's stopping us? He smiled, tilting his head slightly. "It is essential. Have faith in me." There was a moment of uncertainty. It was nothing out of line. It wasn't an offer. It was merely a drive. Yet, there was an undeniable quality in the way he gazed at me. As if he was challenging me. It was as if he had an understanding of my thoughts, anticipating my agreement before I even realized it myself. Perhaps that was the source of my fear. I did indeed say yes. The evening breeze was refreshing as we ventured outdoors. The atmosphere transformed at this time, more serene and gentle, as if it were ours alone, untouched by others. He navigated the road. I settled into the passenger seat, the window slightly ajar, allowing the gentle breeze to flow inside. The city lights streaked by, and for the first time in ages, a sense of liberation washed over me. "Where are we headed?" After some time I inquired. "Nowhere," he stated. That is precisely the point. For some reason that answer resonated with me. We traveled in a serene quietude for a time, the radio emitting gentle melodies that evoked a sense of longing for the past. Once more he began to speak. "It's interesting how your essence shifts in his absence." I glanced at him, a hint of a frown on my face. "Could you clarify what you mean?" He cast a quick look my way before returning his gaze to the road ahead. "You find yourself laughing more often. You genuinely smile. You appear, I can't quite put my finger on it, vibrant." I took a deep breath and glanced at my hands. "Did you see that?" I inquired gently. "I certainly take note." His words carried a certain weight, a quality that sent a subtle shiver racing down my spine. I glanced out the window, my heart racing slightly more than it had moments ago. And that was the moment, the turning point. It had transformed into something far more significant. It was an experience unlike any other, an unarticulated boundary, a threshold we had yet to breach, yet we found ourselves moving closer to it. And even though nothing had transpired yet, I was already aware that this was far from the conclusion. This is merely the start. I ought to have experienced no emotion. That was the mantra I repeated in my mind as we traveled in quietude, the heaviness of his words lingering in the atmosphere. Your essence shifts in his absence. The manner in which he expressed it didn't come across as an accusation. It was never a matter for debate. It was merely a realization, one that caught me off guard, one I wasn't prepared to confront. For the simple reason that it was indeed true. I felt like a different person in the absence of my husband. I felt more like my true self, or perhaps just a version of myself from before I embraced the role of a wife. merely a responsibility, merely a figure lingering in the periphery of another's existence. What's the most frustrating aspect? I appreciated how he observed. I shifted in my seat, letting out a small laugh, trying to dispel the moment, to push aside the peculiar unvoiced tension that lingered between us. I believe you're conjuring up scenarios, I remarked, trying to inject a sense of buoyancy into my tone. He remained silent. He offered me a knowing little smile, the sort that made my stomach tighten for reasons I was unwilling to confront. Perhaps, he remarked, glancing back at the path ahead, perhaps you simply find it difficult to acknowledge. I averted my gaze, swallowing hard. It was merely a drive, merely a dialogue. That was the thought echoing in my mind as we returned to the driveway later that night, lingering in the car for a moment too long, both of us hesitating to make the first move to exit. I appreciate you joining me, he murmured, his hands gently placed on the steering wheel. I nodded, unable to find the words. It was merely a drive, merely an exchange of thoughts, only solace. I kept telling myself that as I entered the house, my heart racing in a manner that felt entirely unwarranted. As I walked past my husband's study, the door firmly shut and the light glowing within, a heavy sensation settled deep within me. An epiphany, a hushed, chilling reality. I hoped he would realize my absence. I longed for him to show some concern. Yet he chose not to. He never did. That evening I found myself in bed, gazing at the ceiling while the calm, consistent sound of my husband's breathing filled the space next to me. He never inquired about my whereabouts. He didn't even glance away from his screen as I walked by. I hadn't even realized the change within me. The way my body vibrated with an energy I hadn't experienced in years, the way my thoughts became entwined with something, someone. That was not him. I reassured myself that it was not a mistake. There was no occurrence. Nothing was destined to unfold. It was merely a fleeting instant. Yet, if it was merely a fleeting instant, what made it resonate with such importance? What was it about his gaze that left my skin tingling in its wake? Why did his voice linger in my mind, gentle and wise? There's more laughter in the air when he's absent. The subsequent days dragged on like a relentless torment. At this moment I had gained awareness. Conscious of his movements throughout the house, how seamlessly he occupied my space, how effortlessly he made me feel acknowledged in ways I had nearly forgotten were attainable. Conscious of the way my stomach churned upon his arrival, of the sudden urge to glance at my reflection in nearby mirrors, of how his presence seemed to carry an unvoiced secret that only I could grasp. And the most troubling aspect, I sensed that he was aware of it as well. I reassured myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination, that he didn't gaze at me the way I imagined he would. The moments I believed we shared were, in truth, non-existent. I wasn't anticipating his presence in the kitchen after dinner, his company on the couch, or the way he would brush past me in the hallway, just a touch too near. That my heart didn't quicken each time he uttered my name. I felt as though I was teetering on the brink of something perilous, something I ought to retreat from before it became irrevocably late. However, the reality was that I had no desire to look back. And that was what filled me with the greatest fear. If I found myself yearning for something that was yet to unfold, perhaps it was a sign that, on some level, my decision had already been made. I ought to have exercised greater caution. It was clear in hindsight that I should have recognized the subtle cues, those little seemingly harmless instances that gradually accumulated, culminating in a reality neither of us could overlook. However, I preferred to embrace spontaneity. I had no desire to cease. And thus it began. It all started with the long, quiet nights. Initially it happened by chance. In the kitchen we would move past one another, I preparing tea while he reached for a drink from the fridge. "You're burning the midnight oil," he'd remark. "Indeed you are as well," I would respond. And just like that we would seamlessly dive into dialogue. Initially it was easygoing and relaxed, the sort of chatter that held no significance. However, it evolved into something greater, more profound, individual. He shared secrets with me that I was certain he kept from others. His apprehensions, the weight of his regrets, the desires he held, yet lacked the means to attain. I shared with him truths I had yet to confront within myself. Have you ever sensed that you're merely going through the motions? One night I inquired, my fingers gliding along the edge of my mug. He let out a gentle breath, tilting his head slightly. Constantly. His response pierced through me, an awareness so profound it seemed as if he had delved into my depths and unearthed something I had long concealed. We lingered in that still, weighty silence, our realities suspended in the air between us. That moment should have been the conclusion. However, it did not. It was tiny, so tiny it ought to have been insignificant. A gentle touch of his fingers brushed against my wrist as he extended his hand toward something on the counter. A moment so brief, so accidental, that I ought to have overlooked it. However, I chose not to. As it resonated within me, experienced the intensity of it, the sensation that ignited along my arm, the way my breath caught just a bit, too faint for him to perceive. Or at least that's what I convinced myself of. Yet it continued to occur. A gentle touch on my back as he brushed by me. A gentle brush against my arm that held for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. An embrace that lacked true warmth, merely a pretext for proximity. Small instances. Insignificant should I choose for them to be. However, that was not the case. With every instance, the sensation deepened within me. With every instance, my desire grew stronger. The house lay in stillness, my husband resting peacefully upstairs, oblivious as ever, to the life unfolding just beyond his shut door. As I lounged on the couch, aimlessly scrolling through my phone, he entered the room. He remained silent initially, just sitting next to me, our legs nearly brushing against each other. I ought to have taken action. However, I did not. After a pause, he remarked, "You often seem deep in contemplation." I stole a look at him, my heart racing in response. Perhaps there's simply an abundance of thoughts swirling around in my head. He observed me intently, his gaze deeper than normal, an enigmatic glimmer dancing behind his eyes. "Feel free to share your thoughts with me." I gulped, feeling an unexpected dryness in my throat. The silence lingered between us, dense and suffocating. And then he extended his hand. Only just sufficiently adequate. His fingers grazed my knee, a touch so delicate, so tentative, that it might have been a mere coincidence. However, it was not the case, since neither of us relocated. In that moment, as the house loomed over us and the outside world seemed unreal, there was a force drawing us closer, something greater than ourselves. An unavoidable occurrence. His gaze fell to my lips. For the briefest moment, I believed he might lean in and kiss me. For the briefest moment, I found myself wishing he would. Yet in that moment I caught wind of it. Noise. A transition to a higher level. My partner shifting in the sheets. The truth hit me with a jolt, cold and relentless. I pulled back abruptly, my breath unsteady, my heart pounding fiercely within my chest. "I ought to retire for the night," I murmured, my voice wavering. He allowed me to continue. Not a single word escaped his lips. He simply observed me, his face a mask of mystery, as I rose and made my exit. As I ascended the stairs, my hands quivered, my body alive with the lingering sensation of what nearly transpired. I was aware. I realized it ought to have ended at that point. It truly ought to have. However, it simply would not. I had overlooked far too many signals already. What comes next? At that moment, I found myself uncertain about the decision to halt. I'm uncertain if I ever truly embraced the concept of fate. I once believed that life was merely a sequence of decisions. Each morning, you rise to meet the day's demands, fulfilling your role with precision. Everything that occurs is a result of your permission. Select it. Yet on that particular night, it seemed more like destiny than a decision. It seemed as though it had been patiently anticipating my arrival. For our benefit. No matter how often I reassured myself that we had crossed a line. It was essential for us to halt, that we would cease. This outcome was inevitable. That weekend my husband was absent. A journey for professional purposes. Or perhaps a symposium. It was significant enough that he hardly mentioned his departure to me. He simply placed his itinerary on the counter. A swift kiss on the cheek before vanishing through the doorway. No, I will miss you dearly. I'm eagerly anticipating my return home. Only emptiness. At that point I had grown accustomed to it. At that point, I had ceased hoping he would realize my absence as well. 2 days had passed in a house devoid of life. 2 days of walking past his vacant study, realizing he would never again enter that space. I wouldn't be at that desk. So absorbed in his craft that he failed to notice my presence. Deep within the recesses of my thoughts, I sensed that this weekend held the promise of something significant unfolding. Perhaps I sensed it the instant my husband revealed he was departing. Perhaps I sensed it the instant I laid eyes on my step-younger brother in the kitchen that morning, coffee mug in hand, bare feet on the cool tile, gazing at me as if he understood I wouldn't be spending this weekend in solitude. Perhaps I had been aware of that long before. It occurred in the late hours. No room left for justifications. It's far too late to act as if it were merely an ordinary evening. The rain began its descent in the evening, gentle at first, then intensifying, enveloping the house in a consistent cadence, reminiscent of an impending alert. We sat in the living room, the television casting a soft glow that was our only illumination. I can't recall what was on. I wasn't really paying attention. I had been observing him closely. He had been observing me closely. The atmosphere surrounding us had been changing for weeks, and we were both aware of it. Each gaze that held on just a bit too long. Each touch that seemed insignificant, yet held deeper meaning. What comes next? At this moment we had moved beyond the facade. "You're unusually silent this evening," he remarked. His tone soft and enigmatic. "So are you," I whispered, my fingers gently curling against the soft blanket that lay across my lap. A moment of stillness. "So gently, are you pondering what I'm pondering?" I ought to have declined. I chose to confront him directly. We were nearly there. More intimate than we had ever experienced previously. The flickering glow of the television painted shadows across his face, accentuating the tension in his jaw and the deepening darkness in his eyes. I experienced it. The instant just before everything transformed. The instant when I had the chance to turn back. However, I did not. As his hand reached for me, finding its way to my cheek, his thumb glided softly against my skin, slow and tentative, a question rather than a demand. I leaned in closer. And just like that, the line vanished. The distance that once separated us vanished. And I allowed it to unfold. His lips radiated warmth. His hands, hesitant initially, then confident. It was not hurried. It lacked urgency. The pace was unhurried. Consider carefully. It was as if we were fully aware of our actions, as if this had been our shared understanding for an eternity. I ought to have experienced guilt. I ought to have considered my husband, my marriage, and every vow I was breaking in that instant. Yet my mind was consumed by the sensation of his touch. The sensation of his breath brushing against my neck. My body had long been deprived of this kind of attention. It transcended the physical realm. It encompassed all that one could desire. His attentive ear. The way he gazed at me as if I held significance. The manner in which he ignited a sense of vitality within me. In that instant, enveloped by the sensation of him. His hands, his lips, the heaviness of his presence against me. I was oblivious to the repercussions. I was indifferent to what lay ahead. I simply desired more. It was only much later, when the room fell into silence once more and the storm outside softened to a light drizzle, that the realization struck me. What I had accomplished. What we accomplished. I rose gradually, wrapping the blanket around myself, my breath lingering in an uneven rhythm, my heart pounding fiercely. He sat beside me in silence, observing me, anticipating. "Are you doing all right?" he inquired gently. "And what about that?" That was what caused the greatest turmoil within me. Since it had been years since my husband had asked me that. I swallowed, nodding, though uncertainty lingered in my mind about its truth. The burden of it was beginning to rest heavily. The heaviness of his presence, of us. I had undeniably crossed a line that was now forever beyond my reach. As I sat there, enveloped in guilt and confusion, grappling with the chilling truth of recent events, a shadowy, subdued voice within me began to murmur softly in the recesses of my thoughts. An aspect of myself I was reluctant to confront. A fragment of my being that felt no remorse. I rose before he stirred. The instant my eyes fluttered open, the weight of reality hit me hard, like a punch to the heart. My heartbeat faltered. My breath was taken away. For a moment I found myself frozen in place. The warmth of his presence still enveloped me. His scent intertwined with my own, the gravity of our actions resting heavily upon me, a secret far too immense to contain. I rose gradually, taking care not to disturb him. My hands shook as I grasped the blanket, wrapping it around myself like a protective barrier, as if it could erase the events of the previous night. As if that could wipe away the memory of his hands on my skin, the way I had surrendered to his touch. I reminded myself to take a breath. Simply take a breath. Yet, how was I to manage that, when the atmosphere in the room seemed so stifling? I had to escape. When he finally stirred from sleep, I was already in the kitchen, clutching a coffee mug, my fingers pressing against the ceramic with an intensity that spoke of my restless thoughts. The gentle creak of the floorboards reached my ears before his figure came into view, each cautious step he took into the room revealing his presence. Initially, silence enveloped us. Our eyes never met. We were uncertain about how to proceed. What about that silence? The stillness resonated more profoundly than any sound. "Hey," he finally said. His voice thick with sleep, deliberate and steady. "Hey," I murmured, my gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in my mug. The atmosphere was thick with unease. Last night seemed destined to happen. Yet now, at this moment, it seemed utterly unattainable. "How are you doing?" he inquired, his tone gentler this time. I compelled myself to nod. Sure, that's acceptable. I was not. We were not. And we were both aware of it. The clatter of keys at the front door ignited a sudden rush of anxiety in my chest. My partner. I had lost track of that feeling, the one that comes with the fear of being discovered, forgotten that I was more than just a woman caught up in the excitement of fleeting encounters. I held the role of a wife. And I had just deceived my husband in the most unforgivable manner. The door swung open before I could even gather my thoughts. And there he was, my husband, entering the room, brushing off the lingering chill of the morning rain. "Morning," he said, placing his bag down. His attention already drifting, retreating into a realm where I faded into mere background noise. "Good morning," I responded, my tone measured and composed. From the periphery of my vision, I noticed my stepbrother stiffen. His jaw clenched, his hands forming tight fists at his sides. For the first time I witnessed it, the burden of our actions settling into him as well. My husband cast a quick look between us, his brow knitting in concern. He observed that I was up early, directing the comment more towards me than himself. I managed a nonchalant shrug, but sleep eluded me. It was neither a fabrication nor a revelation. The way my stepbrother breathed out, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, revealed that he sensed it as well. A sudden change, a fracture, a peril we never anticipated. I believed I could act as if everything was unchanged. I believed I could seamlessly return to my existence, assume my role, and conceal it so thoroughly that it would vanish without a trace. Yet, hidden truths possess an uncanny ability to surface, often in the most subtle of manners. A fleeting look that stretched just a moment too far, a caress that remained, despite the circumstances. A moment suspended in quiet, anticipating the heavy impact of reality. I reassured myself that it was all in my head, that my husband wasn't viewing me in a new light, that he wasn't picking up on the subtle change in the air. Yet suspicion doesn't shout. It whispers. It trickles in gradually, through the fissures, through the unsaid nuances. And once it arrives, it remains. That evening my husband seemed transformed. He observed me. Not in the manner I had always envisioned. Not with affection, not with yearning, not with passion. However, with an alternative approach. A sense of unease lingers. His gaze was palpable during dinner, and the silence between his words echoed with unasked questions. "How did you spend your weekend?" he inquired with an air of nonchalance. "All right," I responded a bit hastily. "Do you and him share a lot of time together?" I almost let my fork slip from my grasp. "Excuse me." He nonchalantly shrugged, bringing the glass to his lips for a sip, simply stating, "You both appear." The words sent a shiver through me. Was he merely engaging in small talk? Or could this be something entirely different? Was he aware? I managed a smile, grasping my glass, attempting to maintain a steady grip. "We are family," I stated plainly. He hummed softly, nodding in agreement. Yet, the way his eyes held mine, the way he allowed the quiet to extend just a fraction too far before breaking the connection, I understood. I was aware. He began to have his doubts. Once doubt creeps in, it lingers indefinitely. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, his back facing me, his breathing steady and calm, I felt confined. Through remorse, through trepidation, with the awareness that I had embarked on a journey beyond my grasp. I shut my eyes, trying to drift into slumber, yet all that filled my mind was his image. My younger stepbrother. This morning, his gaze lingered on me, filled with a longing to connect, yet an understanding that such a touch was now out of reach. His hands last night were electric, eager, as if they had been anticipating my touch for ages. The manner in which I had allowed him. What's even more frustrating, even as guilt gnawed at my throat, even as fear coiled around my ribs, even as I lay beside the man I had promised to remain loyal to. I have no regrets about it. Not at this moment. However, I would. This was merely a beginning. This was merely the start. And I was on the brink of losing it all. What have I created? The question echoed in my mind like a relentless refrain, cycling endlessly, saturating every silent pause, infiltrating every contemplation. Initially, I convinced myself it was merely an error in reasoning, fleeting lapse in strength. Yet, a different voice responded softly in return. Was it really? The undeniable truth, the aspect I couldn't evade, regardless of my desire to do so, was that I had failed to prevent it. I never intended to bring it to a halt. And that was the aspect one couldn't escape from. Guilt is an intriguing phenomenon. It unfolds gradually. It arrives in surges, in hushed tones, in vivid recollections that twist your gut and set your hands quaking. In that moment, as I watched my husband in the morning light, cradling his coffee and casually scrolling through emails, it struck me that for him, everything remained the same. As I walked past the mirror, I sensed a familiar presence in my reflection, probing my features for the essence of the woman I once recognized. Yet amidst it all there emerged something more. A hint of shadow. Something more troubling. For each instance of guilt, there lay another emotion concealed beneath the surface. Subtle, enduring pain. Longing. A recollection of his touch, his lips, his warmth enveloping me. A necessity. And what about that? That was the moment that filled me with the deepest self-loathing. How could I possibly regret something that still sends my heart racing at the mere thought of it? For the next few days, I drifted through life in a fog, navigating my surroundings on autopilot, feigning that everything was all right, feigning that I was all right. Yet within, I was coming apart at the seams. I reassured myself that it would never occur once more. I promised myself I would keep my distance from him. I convinced myself that it had come to an end. Yet language holds no weight when your own flesh turns against you. Each time I caught the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall, my heart raced with anticipation. Whenever I sensed his gaze upon me, a warmth coiled deep within my core. Each time we crossed paths in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the hushed nooks of the house where no eyes were upon us, A moment lingered. A breath suspended in time. A gaze that held on a moment too long. A tension so palpable it seemed to press against my skin, an invisible force poised for my unraveling. I understood the course of action that lay before me. Yet the inquiry lingered. Was I capable of achieving it? For a fleeting instant, I contemplated sharing this with my husband. I'm uncertain about the reason. Perhaps I believed that sharing my burden would lighten the weight of my remorse. Perhaps I believed that by confiding in him, it would compel me to halt before things escalated further. Perhaps I was simply curious to know if he would actually care. One night, as we lay in bed, the silence stretched between us like an unspoken truth. I finally found the courage to speak. I have something important to share with you. The words stood ready just within reach, right on the edge of my thoughts. He didn't even glance in my direction. Delicious. He hummed absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on his phone. In that instant, clarity washed over me. It wouldn't be significant. He chose not to stand up for me. He refused to plead for the truth. He simply wouldn't care. Thus I consumed the words, concealed them thoroughly, and just like that I arrived at my decision. I would keep it to myself. What was the purpose, really? For I was aware beneath the surface. He had already lost my interest. Perhaps I had already lost my sense of self as well. I made an effort to keep my distance from my stepbrother. Indeed, I truly did. However, the reality of crossing a boundary is that once it's done, the illusion of ignorance can no longer be maintained.